Welcome to Week 6 of SGS 304, Foundations of Cross-Cultural Awareness. For this week, we will continue exploring the important role that identity plays when crossing cultures, while giving consideration to the added layer of power dynamics. We'll also discuss some attitudes that can lead to being more culturally appropriate and share some tips for how students might engage with the host culture while studying abroad. Let's begin by looking at the role of power and identity in intercultural interactions. Earlier in this course, we discussed the importance of understanding your own identities and how they will have an impact on your interactions with the host culture. One aspect of identity, though, that frequently is overlooked concerns power. Of course, there are instances when individuals consciously and overtly make use of the power they have over others. Think about a traditional hierarchical workplace environment where there is an appointed boss and subordinate. In most cultures, there is a natural flow of power, with the boss having more of it and the subordinate having less of it. However, there are also many scenarios and times where the power we have as individuals isn't necessarily known to ourselves or actively used. In other cases, perhaps we are aware of our power but have no intentions to use it to our benefit, especially at the expense of others. Of course, there are those individuals who, being aware of their power, will seek to use it to further their own gains. Whether or not power should be used is highly dependent upon the context, but for the purposes of our discussion, let's consider the role power plays in an education abroad experience such as the ones in which you are planning to participate. Consider the questions on this slide. Have you thought about what power you inherently have given some of your identities and culture? Personally speaking, as a Caucasian American male, there are certainly some privileges I am afforded that members of other identity and cultural groups traditionally do not have. Now think about your host culture. Might they have some power that you won't have access to, being an outsider? How will you deal with that? Are there certain areas of your life abroad in which you might struggle not having access to the power you are typically afforded back in your host culture, and when will this and won't this be acceptable? Perhaps most importantly, what does the intersection look like? In other words, how are you likely to be received in the host culture given the inherent power you bring from your own culture, whether or not you are aware or think you do in fact have power? There are two readings I selected for you this week that can help us unpack the complicated cross-cultural discourse that can be at play when issues of power and identity are involved, as they will inevitably be whether or not we are aware. For students from Western societies traveling to societies that may have been colonized by Western cultures in the past, this is a particularly sensitive area that can color intercultural experiences, oftentimes on a subconscious level. Let's consider some key takeaways from each of this week's readings. In Ogden's article, he cautions how modern study abroad programs may lend themselves to perpetuating colonial tendencies and catering to the needs of the colonial student. Historically, the practice of colonialism involved the transfer of people to new territories where they lived for extended periods of time while maintaining allegiance to their home country. If an analogy could thus be drawn with education abroad, a colonial system might be described as the infrastructure which supports the privileged position of the student over the local. This profile, the colonial student, typifies the U.S. university student who really wants to be abroad and take full advantage of all the benefits studying abroad offers, but is not necessarily open to experiencing the less desirable side of being there. The colonial student casts a striking likeness with the early colonial travelers, who also moved across borders within the confines of a political and bureaucratic system of established protocols and practices. Colonial students yearn to be abroad, to travel to worlds different from their own, to find excitement, to see new wonders, and to have experiences of a lifetime. They want to gain new perspectives on world affairs, develop practical skills, and build their resumes for potential career enhancement, all the while receiving full academic credit. Like children of the empire, colonial students have a sense of entitlement, as if the world is theirs for discovery, if not for the taking. New cultures are experienced in just the same way as new commodities are coveted, purchased, and owned. In his article, Ogden paints a picture of the typical colonial student. The good news is that because each of you chose to enroll in this course, you likely won't fall under this category. But many students, often with good intentions, are not aware that they may be exhibiting some of the more negative qualities that make up the colonial student Ogden describes. The colonial student is consumerist in nature. Oftentimes, they select their study abroad program or destination as they might go about purchasing a car or other high-value item. They want to know what excursions they will get to take, how many credits they can obtain in a given period of time, what services they will be provided. Similarly, this leads into expectations and potentially a demand for amenities that are familiar to them from back home. One of the biggest complaints I hear from returned students when asked about their program has nothing to do with the cultural experience and everything to do with amenities. Students often complain about the speed of Wi-Fi when they are traveling abroad. Similarly, students often expect to be lodged in the same level of accommodations they might be used to on an American college campus, which can often not be the norm in other countries. Because of how education is managed in our own American culture, this can extend to expectations or even a sense of entitlement about the level of support professors and other educational staff are expected to provide while abroad. There can be frictions, especially when, in many other cultures, there is not this culture of student services and higher education is a much more independent affair with less grade inflation and different study habits being expected of local students. Colonial students are also quick to embrace certain privileges that are afforded to short-term guests and are not the norm for locals, such as receiving exceptions to standard dietary customs, or access to cleaner or nicer lodging or medical facilities that locals may not have access to themselves. While many students don't intend to act in this manner, their expectations are slanted towards their own home culture, and they may neglect the unintentional power their status as a colonial visitor might bring them. Many of us who choose to study abroad do so with a desire to interact with and learn from the host culture in order to help us understand different ways of thinking. But we can only accomplish this, Ogden argues, if we step off the metaphorical colonial veranda. Think about the study abroad program you have signed up for. Is it likely to make it easy for you to stay within an American bubble? What can you be planning now to help you break out of the comfortable and familiar American bubble, and how can you challenge yourself to dive into experiences that might first feel unfamiliar and uncomfortable? What are some of the things you expect of your life here in the U.S., and how can you let those expectations go in order to learn from the local culture and approximate living as the locals do as closely as you can? The last part of this lesson will offer some tips for doing just that. But mentally preparing yourself to let go of normal expectations and embracing moments where you will be outside your comfort zone are key to stepping off the colonial veranda. In her article, Murphy uses a post-colonial framework and a fascinating case study of a partnership between a U.S. academic team working with a religiously affiliated Kenyan NGO on the promotion of HIV/AIDS education in Kenya to illustrate the complex dynamics that power, identity, and culture play in such a transnational collaborative project. She describes the challenges that each of the teams encounter as stemming from discursive frictions. Discursive frictions are tensions that can arise when various national, social, organizational, and individual cultural differences materialize in our everyday discourse and practices, often privileging, but at times shifting, traditional colonial and post-colonial power relations. These frictions can reinforce and at times shift dominant post-colonial power relations. Murphy identifies three in her article. The first concerns the politics of knowledge. This particular friction is brought up in the present case study when technical or scientific knowledge, which is circulated more broadly in the U.S., comes into contact with the practical local knowledge in Kenyan villages. The issue arose because a member of the Kenyan community complained when the American contingent referenced the contraction of HIV being possible through the act of anal sex. Although this is a scientifically grounded fact in the American context, in stating it would not be seen as promoting nor discouraging this act, in the Kenyan context it was viewed as promoting homosexuality, which goes directly against the values of the church, of which the Kenyan NGO was affiliated. Therefore, a discursive friction arose since one group's knowledge was being privileged over the others. As Murphy explains, the friction demonstrates the tenuous power imbalance in a capacity-building partnership based on these two often competing expert knowledge bases with layered histories, the technical versus the practical or local knowledge. Murphy also provided a fascinating description of how the Kenyan organization attempted to pull power to their side by using silence. As we have already discussed, silence can mean different things across cultures. In the case of the Kenyans here, their silence, in spite of the American group's repeated requests to see the agenda ahead of time and then find out why the curriculum had been changed, went unanswered as a sign of polite respect, as the Kenyans attempted to move their local knowledge into power. In the end, Murphy notes that the U.S. organization had to accept that the Kenyan community would more readily trust their message if it was delivered by a local person. The second discursive friction concerned the choice of language in the curricula. Murphy talks about the Kenyans' request to change the curricula from referring to sex education to education on human sexuality, and the removal of and reference to condoms due to the religious nature of the organization. With condoms being a key preventative measure in Western HIV/AIDS education, the American group had to negotiate with the Kenyans to at least let these references be left in the instructors' materials in case of questions from parents. If you reread this section, you can see how diplomacy is at play, as each of the groups have to toe the line between stating what they need based on their beliefs and values and compromising, since this is a partnership with a common identified goal. Murphy points out that one tactic is to point to external third parties, which each of the groups can use to reduce the stress and tensions each party's demands can bring about when interacting. For the Americans, they used the Center for Disease Control, while the Kenyans invoked the Bishop's Council. The third discursive friction emerged through a tension between spoken and unspoken identities. This occurred during a meeting between the two programs when a call to prayer occurred during the meeting. Two of the U.S. members were not members of the religious group, and so did not bow their heads and make the sign of the cross. Instead, they raised their hands to discreetly scratch their noses, which was enough to not call into question the religious values. Similarly, the American delegation had two individuals who identified as homosexual on it. Given the tensions that existed regarding the perceptions on the part of the Kenyans that some of the curriculum was promoting homosexual acts, even though in the American context it was not, the two members who identified as homosexual chose not to disclose their identities. Murphy notes that it is due to their silence that the U.S. organization is able to make certain negotiations about appropriate language use in the curriculum that errs on the more technical side as opposed to more personal. What's even more interesting is that the Kenyan organization is complicit on maintaining the hidden identities, as they regularly ask the heterosexual female team members about their marriages and families, but never ask the two homosexual men. While some of this may have to do with the gendered norms in Kenyan culture, after a 6-year partnership, it is also likely that the Kenyans have picked up on certain cultural and social cues to keep this topic silent for the sake of moving the project forward. This hiding of some of the Westerners' private identities complicates and repositions the traditional view of power in an international arena as dynamic and fluid rather than solidly and completely held in the hands of the often resource-rich partner. Given these discursive frictions, Murphy presents 5 takeaways for us to consider. First, the case study makes evident the fluidity of power relationships. The partnership between the American group and the Kenyan NGO provided an example of how traditional power roles may be inverted through discursive tactics such as exclusion, silence, and agenda setting. The traditionally powerless, in this case the Kenyans, can exercise some degree of power over the traditionally resource-rich Americans by making use of these tactics, since the two groups have a shared goal. Next, Murphy encourages us to move past nationalistic binaries and consider the importance of the intersectionality of identities. This wasn't just a case of an American group working with a Kenyan group, but it also involved issues related to secularism versus religion and other social identities. This involves the stakeholders having to negotiate the intersection of their sexual, religious, academic, and national identities and the power dynamics that exist within in order to advance the project. The third takeaway is to understand material influence, read power, and the consequences to the ways these conflicts are navigated. As a transnational health collaboration, the partnership exists to stop the spread of a material condition, HIV/AIDS. Each partnership group employs discursive strategies to negotiate control over the material resources. For example, both parties drew on their organizational affiliations. With the university, it was the CDC, or with the Kenyan NGO, it was the Bishop's Council, to vie for power in the discussion over condoms. Materialism drives discourse in that money is power, and the U.S. group represented the money and the technical expertise. Yet it was also made clear that the work could not contradict the dominant values and expectations of the Kenyan NGO's religious affiliation, and if it did, the money would be given back. Next, it is important to develop a nuanced understanding of the relationship between identity and organization. This was especially evident when attempts to use diplomacy were made in order to keep the project moving forward. There were times when both groups identified more with the partnership as opposed to their other, more conflicting identities. At some points, it was helpful for each to connect into the partnership's mission more than their home organization. And finally, the fifth takeaway is the need for an increased understanding of the complexity of voice and working to avoid discursive closure. Care must be taken to decide when it is appropriate and necessary to identify tension, reflect on its importance, and reframe it, or when it is appropriate to remain silent. As was evidenced, there were times when some things had to remain undiscussed in order for the partnership to continue. Silence does not have to be the polar opposite of voice. However, the group that has traditionally been in power must be careful not to force silence upon the other groups in exercising its voice. The USA-CAD and the Kenyan NGO partnership is just one example of how power relations are complicated when competing national, organizational, social, and personal forces intersect in ways that can sustain, reinforce, and challenge dominant patterns of post-colonial power and identity. The lessons learned from Murphy's case study in Kenya are powerful for any of you who might one day see yourself working in an international development, political, or NGO setting. So now that we have read two very great articles about how easy it can be to fall victim to unintentional ethnocentric tendencies, let's consider a few attitudes that travelers can adopt when crossing cultures to attempt to be more culturally appropriate. You may be wondering what role attitude has to play in becoming culturally aware. In fact, this is a very important part of the process. As you can see from these quotes about developing cross-cultural awareness, the attitudes we bring with us during our intercultural journey affect our capacity to engage with and learn from those that we meet. Before you begin your study or intern abroad experience, it would be helpful to take some time to reflect on the following attitudes that have been shown to be important in developing cross-cultural awareness. As mentioned in a previous lecture, the attitude of curiosity is among the most sought-after traits in recent college graduates. A study by Caligari and Tariq looked at 420 global leaders and found that top leaders were all culturally curious. Personality characteristics such as curiosity predispose individuals to be open and receptive to learning the norms of new cultures, to initiate contact with host nationals and gather cultural information, and to handle the high amounts of stress associated with the ambiguity of the host national environments. All are related to effectiveness on developmental global assignments. Thus, personality characteristics can enhance or limit an individual's ability to be effective on the tasks of the assignment and to reap, or not, the developmental benefits of having been given a developmental opportunity. Furthermore, the study suggested that developmental cross-cultural experiences can occur through both work-related and non-work activities. This has implications for your study abroad experience because it means you have the potential to develop cross-culturally both during your formal academic experiences and during your leisure activities. What matters is if you bring a spirit of curiosity and these other attitudes with you. Another important aspect of curiosity is that it can be the precursor to developing empathy. Culturally curious people are more apt to be empathetic, which is key to understanding and connecting with other cultures. When you are genuinely interested in knowing about others, you are more prone to trying to put yourself in their place and attempting to understand where they are coming from. That's it for this week's lecture, so please refer to Blackboard and the syllabus for details on this week's homework assignments. Thanks, and have a great week.